would be an apology to her, but to all female students as well, just on behalf of SSU. Just want to apologize for the fact you had to go through all of your experience with SSU with the senior leadership positions being men. I'm just really sorry about what that may in any way communicate. Hope one day we'll change that. Hope, not one day, hopefully soon. Change that. If anyone wants my job, you can apply. But I don't think it's coincidental that in recent years we've had several theses done on about women, issues related to women, and at least a couple done related to men. And I think it's not coincidental that these are big questions in our times as people try to get wisdom in the midst of change. And so I appreciated Matthew jumping into that fray and working on that question wisely, speaking about men, women, which was a good call, I think. But in his thesis, Matthew would like to point out that in our present day we have not done an adequate job of preparing men who grow up into the kind of men who care for humanity and the world around them. The extra tragedy of this fact is that we now have so much potential help from psychology for how we could do this well. And so he delves into various branches of psychology to find some of the available help for our religious and cultural communities to do a better job of this. I think you will hear his passion for this potential and for his experience with one particular community that has done this for him. I wanted to share a couple quotes. The first is a quote from G.K. Chesterton. It's maybe more of an in-house joke, but I hope everyone can appreciate this. But this is a quote from G.K. Chesterton. To a Christian, existence is a story which may end up in any way. In a thrilling novel, the hero is not eaten by cannibals, but it is essential to the existence of the thrill that he might be eaten. The hero must, so to speak, be an eatable hero. So Christian morals have always said to the man, not that he would lose his soul, but that he must take care that he didn't. In Christian morals, in short, it is wicked to call a man damned, but it is strictly religious and philosophic to call him damnable. So forgive me if along the way I added thrill to the process. Why don't you say a prayer for Matthew? I'm going to begin with a prayer from Sigmund. Here, come join me for this. Matthew. I want to say a prayer. Beginning with the prayer of Ignatius, which is not so much about this presentation right now, but about you as you go forward in with these ideas and with this passion in you. And I'll improvise a little at the end after Ignatius. Forgot to include a specific blessing for you. Dearest Lord, teach me to be generous. Teach me to serve you as you deserve, to give and not to count the cost, to fight and not to heed the wounds, to toil and not to seek for rest, to labor and not to ask for reward, save that of knowing I am doing your will. And God, particularly I want to take that spirit which I see so strongly in Matthew and pray that it would shine forth in his talk and in everything that he does, and as he continues his studies and he goes on in the world. So thank you for being present in the room and with Matthew this afternoon.
Hey, thank you very much, Walter. So, I wrote this thesis for two reasons. First, because I was curious to see how the influences of various kinds of relationships between men affect their psychological development throughout their lifespan. And the second reason, as Walter alluded to, was because society today is feeling the effects of what happens when male development goes poorly and men express their masculinity in antisocial ways that injure society. These antisocial expressions of masculinity come in a wide range of men, such as men who are unable or unwilling to accept and sustain the responsibilities of a husband and a father, or shy away from positions of responsibility, proactivity and leadership within their communities. They also include men who are a more actively damaging influence in society, such as the influence of members of gangs. In the discussions that I've had about this subject, it's occasionally been suggested to me that this is natural for men in a boys will be boys sort of way. And whenever I've heard that, something about it hasn't sat right with me. I agree that antisocial men, masculine expression in men can be a natural outcome, but a natural outcome of what? What I found in psychological research leads me to believe that antisocial men are a partial product of a lack of stability, support, and guidance from other men. In particular, they are lacking the guidance and support of other men, men who are walking or have walked a similar journey, men who understand male experience and are able to provide their wisdom and their support. Over time, this deprivation grows into a wound in the relationships between older and younger generations of men that causes both to suffer. But I don't think it has to be that way. The relationships that men have with each other are not all defining in their development and the directions they choose, but they certainly have a unique and influential role within them. I wanted to explore what psychology can tell us about the abilities of men to stabilize, guide, and enrich one another in their development. The thesis was guided by questions of what if men could influence one another in such a way that they could help one another to develop healthily, to have a positive understanding of how a man should act, and to desire to work for the benefit of others. What if men could foster in one another an idealism that would encourage them to find new and creative ways to do this? If men are capable of helping one another in these ways, how does this happen? What is necessary, and where do we start? In the thesis, I don't focus so much on what can go wrong with male development, but rather I focus on exploring what is ideally possible if men take it upon themselves to guide and support each other through every stage of life. But that guidance and support needs to have a goal. And so I wrote the thesis with the goal of exploring how are men able to help each other to develop healthily and to be pro-social. Now, a researcher named Eisenberg has defined the aspect of being pro-social as displaying behavior that is intended to benefit others. Antisocial, on the other hand, is a spirit of disobedience to the norms and the expectations of the society that we live in. And antisocial is also displaying behavior that disregards the welfare of others and the concerns of others. This thesis looks primarily at three fields of psychology: developmental, social, and narrative psychology. I looked at developmental psychology to explore theories that are out there about how people develop and what has been said about how men contribute to each other's development through life stages. Social psychology plays a role because if you're going to talk about how people influence each other, you need to explore questions of social interaction, like how do we acquire behavior? What does it mean that we have a self? And how do we interact with our environment? Narrative psychology was important because people have a deep need to make sense of themselves through the progression of time. That self-understanding takes place in the form of a story. Societies, cultures, and religions also understand themselves in terms of stories. This affects how men who live within those societies, cultures, and religions grow to understand themselves and interact with one another. As I continued to do research in these fields, I started wondering what a particularly effective environment would be where men can help each other to develop healthily and interact pro-socially with the world. Everything pointed toward rites of passage, so I'll be doing some exploration there as well. Even after I explored the theory behind all these ideas, I realized that it isn't just enough to say, theoretically, it seems fair to conclude that men play an important role in helping each other to develop well and to be pro-social. You need hard evidence that this is actually what's happening. So we'll also be taking a look at a camp that I've been involved with for several years, the Arcathios Boys Camp, as a study of these ideas that are in the thesis. And without further ado, we will begin exploring the developmental theory involved in male development. So the theorist Erik Erikson has postulated a developmental model called the 8 Ages of Man, which is the idea that our life is developed into 8 stages, each of which has a developmental dilemma that we face. One is positive and one is negative. And depending on how we resolve each of these dilemmas that impacts our ability to face the next one. Is a bad solution going to lead to a worse one? Is a good one going to lead to a better one? So with that in mind, the initial days of a man's life are critically important. John Bowlby suggested in his attachment theory that a child's first influential relationships are the relationships he has with his parents. He suggests that the treatment the child receives from his parents forms an attachment pattern that heavily influences the child's confidence in his approach to the world. Bowlby initially thought that only mothers played a significant role in forming a child's attachment pattern, but as research progressed, it became evident that fathers were also an influential figure in this process. As the child continues to grow, the benefits of an involved father in a son's life become increasingly evident, manifesting in ways such as improved cognitive development, social capabilities, and heightened interpersonal problem-solving abilities. Sarah Allen and Carrie Daly say that, quote, father involvement is positively correlated with children's overall social competence, social initiative, social maturity, and capacity for relatedness with others. Children of involved fathers are more likely to have positive peer relations and be popular and well-liked. Their peer relations are typified by less negativity, less aggression, less conflict, more reciprocity, more generosity, and more positive friendship qualities. Unquote. Father involvement is also positively correlated with a son's adequate development of particular traits, such as personal discipline, self-worth, and self-image. The primary influence that a father exerts on his son's growth, according to B. Mark Schoenberg, is that he, quote, helps his son convert expressiveness into the male mold. He models things like how men handle friendships, unquote. As a young man continues to grow, different kinds of relationships with other men become important influences in his life. As he reaches adolescence, a boy begins to experience a profound need for individuation. He needs to cultivate a confidence that he is his own man, and a necessary part of that journey involves a testing and a questioning of the wisdom, authority, and significance of the immediate male figures in his life, such as his father. During this time, Schoenberg suggests that the peer group becomes the young man's preeminent shaper of his education into masculinity.
Wow.
Despite being a necessary stage in his development, this is a turbulent time for the young man because his loyalties are shifting. However, Schoenberg believes that even though the father's authority is being questioned, he can still be a stabilizing influence on his son by reassuring him that his actions are not a betrayal, but rather are an essential part of his development. Even though the adolescent man tests the authority and wisdom of the immediate adult males in his life, he remains receptive to the influence of mentoring from his senior peers. Daniel Levinson says that, quote, a good mentor is an admixture of a good father and a good friend, a transitional figure who invites and welcomes a young man into the adult world and helps him to acquire a sense of belonging to the generation of promising young men, unquote. Once he reaches the years of young adulthood, he encounters a developmental need for intimacy, affiliation, and commitment, and he is willing to make sacrifices to achieve this. This is a stage where a man's life becomes about deciding what he will commit himself to and the allies who will aid him in that journey. A man must be received by his fellow men during this time and form strong affiliations with them. If this does not happen, Erickson believes that the young adult man will become developmentally isolated. In the absence of intimate community and affiliation with other men, he becomes, quote, ready to isolate and, if necessary, destroy those forces and people whose essence seems dangerous to his own, unquote. If a man's development continues to follow a healthy trajectory through the intimacy versus isolation stage, his developmental needs will begin to revolve around generativity and his legacy. According to Erickson, quote, mature man needs to be needed. Generativity is primarily the concern in establishing and guiding the next generation, unquote. Now that he has reached full adulthood, a man encounters his developmental need to become a supporting figure for younger men. Because he has previously encountered the influence of father figures and mentors, he now appreciates the importance of his own entry into such roles. There's a communal influence among developing men. In every type of relationship that exists among young men, They affect one another's development. At any point in a man's development, he encounters particular developmental needs and tasks. His ability to engage the tasks of future stages is influenced by his experience of the stage that he is currently in. And his experience of that stage is affected by the other men in it. A man's childhood years and his experience of a father figure influence his assumptions about how men are supposed to act in the world. His experience of a community of peers tells him how other men actually act and what they believe about manhood. No matter how the adolescent man's peers conduct themselves, that conduct informs him as to whether or not other developing men are reaching the same conclusions as he is about manhood. When he reaches adulthood, he will be affected by whether or not there are other men with whom he can affiliate in a deep and meaningful way. Men whom he can identify with, support, and be supported by. Later in adulthood, his development will be affected by his experience in teaching the next generation of men. Do they receive and integrate his teaching? Do they respect his wisdom and experience? The answers to these questions will affect his perception of his own journey as a man. Has it been fruitful or has it been futile? A man's experience of relationships with other men will also heavily influence how he perceives his own manhood, and whether he grows to care about that manhood, and whether he sees it as something valuable, worth preserving and fostering in others. So that's the spiel for chapter 1, the developmental psychology. Basically it boils down to men need men throughout their lifespans. Their experience of other men helps them understand manhood and their own manhood. So while it's all well and good that developmental psychology can tell us that men need men, it's social psychology that can tell us about how this all takes place. So men affect one another's development for good or for ill, we got that. Their development understanding of their own manhood is affected by their interactions with one another. A social psychological school of thought called symbolic interactionism holds that, quote, people act toward things on the basis of the meanings that they ascribe to those things. The meaning of such things arises from the social interaction that one has with one's fellows and is handled through an interpretive process, unquote. In other words, the interactions that a man has with other men influences the ways that he sees them. It influences the meaning that he derives from those experiences. By extension, the way that he sees those experiences and the way that he sees other men understanding their own manhood will affect how he understands and interprets and lives out his own manhood. His understanding of manhood is affected by how other men act. Herbert Bloomer describes this saying that, quote, other men define a person to himself, unquote. And depending on his interactions with other men, his understanding of manhood may lead him to act in either pro-social or anti-social ways. Now, this being said, a man's social interactions do not have unlimited power to define his self-understanding. Bloomer explains that people have a sense of self that doesn't just respond to the things that influence it. It engages with them, and in some cases it even pushes back. A man he has his own interpretive process when he's confronted with his social experiences, and he reaches his own conclusions. However, the decisions a man makes regarding how he will act out his manhood are influenced by the limits of what he knows. A man is unable to consider a way of life that he doesn't know exists. He is more likely to choose behaviors that have been modeled for him. Albert Bandura calls this social learning theory. Social learning theory involves the idea that, quote, behaviors are acquired through the influence of example, unquote. A man's social interactions also influence what Bandura would call his efficacy beliefs, or his belief in his ability to succeed in life. The critical male figures in a man's life, such as his father, his peers, and his mentors, play a large role in determining whether or not he will develop strong efficacy beliefs. He requires their affirmation and support as he develops in order to believe that he can handle life's challenges. It's also important to consider the fact that men influence one another through their social interaction. They develop together, they model behaviors for one another. Over time, their attitudes and their behaviors and their understandings of manhood can grow to influence all of the men in an entire society, religion, or culture. those understandings of manhood, they become institutional. They become what's expected of the men in that group. Those expectations become an influence on how men believe they should act. A man is influenced not only by the example of other men, but also by the values of the society in which he lives. And the men who influence him by their example are also being influenced by those societal values. Societal values have potential to benefit male development and encourage prosocial behaviors in men. For example, a society that encourages men to become husbands and fathers will have an effect on the way that those men interpret their own manhood. A man in that society will socially interact with other men who are also impacted by those ideals and who are striving to rise to them. Those social interactions will influence his life priorities and his sense of what it means to succeed at being a man. Narrative psychology also plays a really important role in understanding how this works. Because, as I mentioned earlier, the human being has a deep need to make sense of himself as time progresses. He starts asking himself, who am I on the basis of where have I come from? What have I been through? The way that people make sense of their experience is to understand it as a story. Theodore Sarban suggests that we naturally impose a narrative structure on the way that we understand our experience. Actions have a basically historical character. People make sense of one another's actions by interpreting them with regard to the past, according to Alistair McIntyre. We ask ourselves questions of what happened in the past that explains this person's current actions. Human beings are storytellers by nature, says Daniel McAdams. For McAdams, this natural storytelling tendency is so deeply ingrained in the human psyche that it forms the basis for how people construct their self-understanding. He describes this as the making of a personal myth, or the heroic story of the self. Throughout all of life's ups and downs, McAdams suggests that humans have a profound psychological need for their personal myth to make, quote, a compelling aesthetic statement, unquote. It needs to ultimately be a good story. He states that the quality of how a man sees his personal myth is an important contributing factor in whether his developmental needs are fulfilled. Now the million-dollar question, what does this have to do with how the relationships between men help them to grow? Narrative psychology affects relationships between men at two levels. First, it affects them at a local level. The way that a man experiences other men affects his self-narrative. It affects how they see themselves as the main character of their own story. Depending on how the child is treated by his father, his peer groups, and his mentors, answers his questions of, am I good or bad? Am I capable or incompetent? Am I valuable or worthless? Do I enrich others or not? The answers to those questions deeply affects the way that his story will continue to unfold. They govern what he believes and what he holds to be possible or impossible, and how he feels that he should act. Men act in accordance with the stories that they believe about themselves. Narratives also influence male development from a higher level. Cultures, societies, and religions also understand themselves through narratives. They have a sense of who they are as a result of where they have come from. They also teach the people who live in them how they are supposed to live. McIntyre says that, quote, I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what. A man's understanding of what it means to live and act like a man will be influenced by the beliefs of the culture, society, and religion that he lives in. He isn't just discovering what it means to be a man, he's discovering what it means to be a Canadian, American, or Algerian man. He's discovering what it means to be a Christian, Muslim, Jewish, or atheist man. Whatever a man's society, culture, and religion believe about manhood will affect his own development and his interactions with other men, because the other men in his life are influenced by those same ideologies. I'd like to give an example of what I just described. Over the last few years, I've been learning about a set of teachings from the Catholic Pope John Paul II, who taught a lot about God's plan for men and women and how they should act toward one another. And one particular quote from his teachings has deeply impacted me and a lot of the men that I've known and grown up around. The quote is, God has assigned as a duty to every man the dignity of every woman. unquote. We take that teaching very seriously. We try to live it out, and we think a lot about how to do that. And we try to support each other and give each other feedback in that journey. Our understanding is that if we are going to truly live as real men, this has to be a part of that. That was just one example. There could be 900 more that shapes our collective understanding of what it is to live as men. But just look at the influence that one idea can have on a man if he says, if I'm going to be a man, I have to do this. At this point you might be thinking, well, these ideas are great and maybe this helps a man to develop a secure self-identity, but not every culture encourages men to be pro-social. And that's true. Sometimes men are taught to be exclusive, or they are not taught the importance of working to benefit others. But in this thesis, I wasn't able to look for a solution to that problem because my focus was to primarily explore how can men hate each other rather than looking for solutions to political and social divides. And we do have some tools that are available to us that can be very effective, not only in helping men to develop healthily, but in teaching them and motivating them to be pro-social in the world. This is where we get into rites of passage. The fourth chapter of this thesis was about rites of passage and how they are particularly effective in helping men to develop healthily and how they can be designed to help men be pro-social as well. According to Arnold van Gennep, a rite of passage is a time when a person or group of people is separated from society, undergoes a ritual of transition, and then is reintegrated into society in their new role. Many cultures have used rites of passage to help men make necessary transitions from one life stage to the next, such as the transition from boyhood to manhood. Rites of passage are powerful because they give a man a specific event that tells him he is growing and that he is growing well. They help a man's development to be a little more black and white. At a time when he needs it, they give him the opportunity to say, I was not a man before, and now I am one. According to Macaulay and Lawson, rites of passage have a strong emotional power on their participants. They can produce lifelong changes by evoking, quote, the remembrance of things past and the desire of things to come, unquote. They give a man a clear and powerful experience of the story that he is a part of. They also powerfully influence a man's development, because once he completes the rite, he belongs to a new social category and is treated accordingly. When a boy is initiated into manhood, the members of his religion or culture are in agreement that he is now a man and that he should be treated like one. The lessons that the participant takes away from this are, I am growing well, the community approves of me, I am succeeding in the journey to maturity, I am ready for adult responsibility. He believes these things and he is motivated to keep it that way. Victor Turner believes that the rite of passage is an experience that reshapes its participants. Within it, the participant is in a state of what Turner calls liminality, which is a state of transition. He is no longer what he was, but he is not yet what he will become. Turner says that, quote, the neophyte, the person in the rite of passage, must be a blank slate on which is inscribed the wisdom and the knowledge of the group, in those respects that pertain to the new status. The wisdom imparted in sacred liminality has ontological value. It refashions the very being of the neophyte, unquote. Turner gives an example of this. In the Ndembu tribe, I believe they're located in Zambia, when the tribe has a member of the chief-elect, a man who's about to rise to the status of chief, he's subjected to a rite of passage. And the community, for one day, is allowed to abuse him through arbitrary use of power. This may be an extreme example, but the idea behind this, the reason that they do this, is that this shapes his understanding of how power should be used and what the consequences are when it's misused. He becomes far less likely to abuse his own power as a result. Rites of passage also foster an interesting type of community in their participants. Because they have no status during the rite, participants develop what Turner calls communitas. Because they are equals during the rite of passage, this way of seeing each other through a lens of equality endures even after the rite of passage, and it impacts the way that they approach the world. Their social conscience is improved. They do not take their status for granted and are less likely to be oppressive to others. Rites of passage in the past have seemed to naturally address what men needed in order to help their development. But today, rites of passage are aided by all of the psychological and social scientific knowledge that we have about ourselves as human beings. We have theories of human development, and that knowledge can be helpful in how we design rites of passage in the modern day. Knowing the particular developmental needs that a man has at a particular age and the types of conflict that he's experiencing is helpful when we consider today how to formulate a rite of passage that is beneficial to modern men. Our theories can take into account things like developmental, social, and narrative psychology, like we've been discussing. This is just as well because today there are conflicting influences on a man's development that didn't used to exist. And one of these conflicting influences can actually be life within a pluralistic society. Just a disclaimer here, I'm not saying that pluralistic society is bad, I'm just pointing out how it can be a source of conflict in a man who's trying to figure out who he is. There's a difference. There is a difference. Anyway. Rites of passage are time-tested in their ability to benefit a man's development and the security of identity. But a big part of that was because when he would go through his culture or his religion's rites of passage, the world he lived in would approve of him. But what if this isn't necessarily the case in a pluralistic society? What if certain societal groups, other than one's own, express disapproval of his initiation? What if they criticize him for it? What if they express disapproval of the values he's being taught to live by? These influences, especially if they come from the men of other backgrounds, pose a threat to the effectiveness of rites of passage in pluralistic societies. Cultures and religions, if they wish to address this, they don't need to shut themselves off or detract from the value of the views of other societies, but they do need to equip the men that they're initiating how to field the questions that they might encounter in other people, and how to address those questions gracefully. To give you an idea of an example of how sometimes this can work, I'd like to tell you a bit about my own experience with the Arcathios Boys Camp. It's a camp located in the Rockies in southern Alberta. So the Arcathios Boys Camp is a Roman Catholic camp that is designed for men aged 7 to 17 to give them an experience of basically a boot camp-like environment where they can practice things like physical discipline, learn wilderness and survival skills, cadet type stuff. And it's also a time where they undergo deep faith formation and formation in leadership. Its participants undergo a time of formation wherein they are instructed in ideals of Christ-like manhood. They're in a liminal state. They have a common experience at the camp, and there's little that differentiates them. Upon completing the program, they are able to receive medieval titles such as squire and knight, and they are actually formally initiated into those categories, sword and all. And the idea is that when they are given those titles, they are encouraged to honor what that title stands for and try to live it out back in the real world. Arcathios offers its participants instruction in the teachings and the practices of the Catholic faith within a military-style environment involving discipline and a hierarchical structure and boot camp-like training. Arcathios also offers its participants an immersive, interactive experience within a fantastical theatrical story centered around a heroic battle of good against evil. So the founder of the camp, Dr. Brian Doran, he explains that boys need a rite of passage so that they can identify as men in normal society. And they also need exposure to a story that tells them why that's important, and why it's urgent to live that out. And so this story is full-blown theatrical. It's a medieval setting, and the boys find themselves as soldiers in service of Christ the King. And meanwhile, there are basically creatures that are attempting to damage Christ's kingdom. Basically, they look like orcs from the Lord of the Rings. And the idea is, and The boys get an experience of actually fighting these forces of evil. Meanwhile, they're being taught, they're being debriefed after these scenarios and saying, what do these forces represent? What are the forces of injustice in the world that you need to fight against? When you go back into the real world, do you remember that sense of conviction that you had when you were fighting against these villains here? You need to translate that back into being a strong leader in your community back home. The camp also offers an experience for adult men, particularly the fathers of the boys in attendance, and they often attend the camp as members of the team, since the camp aims to offer a unique father-son experience. The camp operates on a belief that in order to properly instruct young men to imitate Christ, they must engage in activities that allow them to learn about their natural strength and their male attributes, while being guided in how to properly use those strengths for the benefit of others. Every year that a boy returns, he advances on the journey toward becoming a man. The assistant director, Evan McNeil, comments that at Arcathios, manhood is plainly laid out. You're part of a squad, and year over year you progress into high ranks and are given more responsibility. This is intentionally coupled with guidance, and military structure is designed for this purpose. Boys are then faced with a challenge, a mission which they overcome, and as a result are transformed in the way that they view themselves and each other. There's a special kind of bonding and trust that occurs when you overcome a mission together. You may never even see each other again, but that bond will always be there." Unquote. Arcathios approaches the concepts of manhood and masculinity with very precise notions of what they are and what they do and do not entail. They present high ideals of men taking responsibility for every aspect of their lives, such as leadership and care of their families, and following the teachings of Christ with a profound spirit of obedience and humility. However, rather than presenting these teachings as a collection of abstract concepts, these notions are taught within the overarching unity of a narrative. The urgent call to live out these ideals is reinforced by the fact that the camp's storyline revolves around a battle between good and evil. Doran, the founder, explains this, saying that, quote, "In real life, boys must encounter the fight between good and evil. And so here at camp they have the opportunity to see a mission, to see a battle lived out, and to see that with Christ we can overcome that evil." Arcathios is also intentional with its use of an all-male environment. The camp's executive director, Norman Hebert, asserts the centrality of this aspect of the camp's environment, mentioning that such an environment affords them the opportunity and circumstance to, quote, "improve on behaviors that are becoming of a Christian," and to teach the participants specific lessons with a sense of importance and urgency that does not naturally occur in regular life. For example, Arcathios teaches its participants in great depth of the importance of treating women with respect and dignity. Occasionally, the camp will theatrically introduce a female presence, but the director says that these instances are used to reinforce the lessons taught to the boys and only occur after the campers have been specially prepared for it so that they can truly appreciate the lesson being taught. Arcathios has met with consistent post-camp feedback over the years, with parents reporting things like improved relationship dynamics in their families, increased obedience to authority and initiative to take on leadership in their sons, and renewed commitment from fathers and husbands. I'd like to share with you some condensed selections from an interview I conducted with one of these men this summer. Jeff Evans has attended Arcathios for 4 years, and his sons have attended for 5. The camp has significantly impacted their family, says Evans. Quote, "My sons have been tremendously impacted by the program. It brings out the best in them and brings the core of a young man to life. They can relate to the story of Arcathios and apply it to their regular lives. The challenge occurs when they return to their real world and realize that it is unlike Arcathios, but they can take the things that they learn at camp, such as forming a team of brothers, to help overcome those issues. They are encouraged and mentored here. They remember their teachers and look forward to continuing their journey with their brothers from camp. I also draw strength from my experience at Arcathios, which helps me with my sons in the real world. The structure of the camp is important because it gives a healthy basis for boys to grow into young men. They become courageous men of action, confident in who they are as men of God. Being in a medieval military environment forces them to be responsible in ways that they aren't responsible back at home unless they are put into a leadership role. What I like about the theatrics here is that they bring to the forefront things that we couldn't normally see. They visualize themes in life such as our ability to rise and fall again, or the hidden battles that occur between good and evil in the real world. Here you live the story. You're part of the outcome. Also at camp, the lead characters are seen making mistakes, and they have been seen being forgiven. These characters have been seen making decisions under pressure that could play out for good or for bad. And in this way, the camp's theatrics illustrate the very real challenges of life. Evans also shared more personally how his experience at the camp provides support for hurts that were sustained in his own past. Quote, "When I was 11, my parents got divorced, and it crushed me. And my dad didn't know how to be a father because his dad didn't know how to be a father. What we experience from our fathers can be positive or negative in our relationships with our sons. And my lack of a father, I'm 41 years old, I see the effects to this day. I see how I've battled with my own identity, with insecurity in who I am as a man. I've battled with so many things and with direction. I didn't have a father to say, 'Son, you're good at that. If you fostered this, you could do this for a living. Do you enjoy this?' I didn't have that. It wasn't until I was 30 years old that I heard that my dad was proud of me. It took 30 years of my life to hear that my dad was proud of me, but I needed that when I was 10, when I was 12. I needed that as a young man. And now as a young man, I had 4 kids and a wife, and I wept when I heard that my dad was proud of me. Because that boy as a child never got that. The child within me wept because it longed to hear the affirmation of a father. So this camp has encouraged me to see my son's gifts and to nurture those gifts and to see how they need me to back them up. Even when they fall, to know that they have a father who loves them and still, no matter what, will love them and is proud of them for who they are and who they are becoming. It's like night and day how essential the male role is between a father and son. And the same for daughters as well, but that's another topic. So I think it's crucially important for us to experience this camp because it not only builds me as a man, as a husband, and as a father, but it also builds my sons. And as a result of my being built up, I can help build them up now. I can encourage them and support them. I can help them when they are down. I can praise them when they are up. It gives me tools that I didn't have from my own father. It gives me examples, watching priests, watching other fathers who are in healthy marriages. And because it helps me, I can help them. Arcathios has, unquote, Arcathios has produced many stories that are very similar to Jeff's. And the opportunities that the camp offers have resonated with a felt need in society to the extent where the directors of the camp have been in dialogues regarding how to replicate the camp all over the world because people are saying, we see how men are before this experience, we see how men are after the experience, and there needs to be more of that. So I'm more or less out of time. This was a bit of a whirlwind tour. But in conclusion, I wrote this thesis kind of as a basic exploration of what we know psychologically about male development and the role that men play in one another's development and how they can help encourage and teach each other to engage in the world in a way that builds up others. And it's been meant to explore and provide some answers to the question of if modern societies and cultures and religions and the powers that be wanted to foster those things in the men of today, how would they do it and what would they have to take into consideration? Men are able to impact every person that they come into contact with, but they require guidance and support, especially from one another, throughout their entire lives in order to do this. Attempts to cultivate and encourage in a widespread fashion the things that we know help men to grow will positively impact our future and our ability to produce well-adjusted, mature, responsible male leaders from one generation to the next. Concluded. Can I say one quick thing there, Walter?
No.
reinforce the difficulty of writing a psych thesis about
I
this.
suspect there may be questions or responses that you would like to share.
Yeah, so you were talking about the archaethos structure and how effective that is for young boys. Do you think, and the desire for that to spread out more, like around the country, around the world, do you think that that same model would be effective in other countries, other cultures, fundamentally, or do you think it, like how it might change?
Yeah, the feedback that the directors have received, I'm not a part of these dialogues, but I hear stuff through the grapevine, is that people have come from other countries and they have said, my country needs this. We had one guy one year come in from France who said, I would like to replicate your model. I don't know whatever happened to the dialogue, but he evidently perceived a felt need in French men that he thought the methods of the camp could help to address. Yes, Catherine?
What would you say to critics of a military-style, combat-driven atmosphere,
Yeah.
saying something along the lines of we don't need a replication of violence when we already have so much?
Totally, perfect question. And this this was something that was addressed in the thesis, but I didn't explore as much in this presentation as I could have. The camp is very careful to guard against to guard against the influence on the boys that they might say, oh, I can go and be violent, I can go and be aggressive. Like, the teachings are very in-depth, and the entire leadership structure is basically tailored to discourage that kind of that kind of interpretation by the participants. And also, the camp, they kind of have, you might describe it as an informal accountability system as well. Like it's expected that the people who've been through the camp will kind of group together after the camp to look to each other for support, to hold themselves accountable to what the teachings were. And so they kind of have eyes and ears and experienced leaders from their program who are kind of present all over Western Canada. That's where they get most of their participants who try and guide that process as it goes on. Also, I need to reiterate that the ideas of the combat in camp, it's explicitly taught that the forces you're fighting against are not people. Like this is why I described it as orcs, right? Like there's it wasn't based on the idea of violating other people's rights or something like that, but rather these are forces of social injustice incarnated, basically. And you need to learn to translate how you feel when you're fighting those forces into the real world. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Danny?
One question I had was, you mentioned that the camp felt it was essential that it be a exclusively male environment. Can you elaborate on that, and why is that so specific? I mean, maybe it seems like the answer is obvious, but why, and how that translates, like the principles of the camp, how that translates into real life and like young men growing and being formed in the world. Like, it's not
for sure. When I conducted an interview, with the executive director Norm Bear, he explained it to me that the environment is kept all male so that the participants are basically free of conflicting influence, and they all understand one another's experience. There's a neuropsychology paper that I quoted in the thesis by a man named Charles Zaroff that says men are neuroanatomically different even from women in such a way that makes their emotional experience different and makes them more uniquely suited to understand one another's experience, to teach them how to work with that experience. And so that was one of the reasons that they do that. And he also says that that there's kind of a freedom that's allowed by the men where I lost what he said. I'll try and paraphrase it. The freedom afforded to the men is that they can feel free to explore what am I feeling as a growing man, and they can do that within a structured, safe environment. They can explore how that manifests. They can explore ways to even if it happens to manifest negatively, they have guidance to help them channel that social energy more positively, even if it doesn't look like that at the beginning.
The other question I had was the principles of the camp, do you think they can be applied just as effectively in a non-Christian context? Like you put a lot of
Yeah.
weight on like Christ-like virtue,
Yeah,
Christ-like
totally.
men, but could you take that out of the equation, or do you believe it can be
Totally.
as effective?
I believe that it can. The idea, again, that's expressed in the thesis is that the example I used in Arcatios was not to suggest that camp or Roman Catholicism has some sort of superior ability to produce well-adjusted, well-developed pro-social men. That was just the experience that happened to be used. And so the idea is that rites of passage are proven in a time-tested way to be beneficial to helping men develop. And so I think the principles could be easily applied. The idea of pro-social men that's explored in the thesis is the idea that maybe we can't bridge every political divide, right? But we can identify certain things that we can foster in men, certain attitudes and behaviors. They were saying it would be good if men near and far display these kinds of attitudes, and we're pretty sure that every culture can strive to produce those attitudes in men, whatever their rites of passage would happen to look like. Yeah.
Thank you.
Rachel.
Do you think that in like that sort of camp setting, a different narrative structure could work just as well as the kind of battle structure, like a quest or something? Or do you think there's something unique about that military kind of battle structure that works for this?
For sure. The assistant director, Evan McNeil, he actually kind of took me aback. He referenced psychology of play, which I didn't include in the thesis because I don't know enough about it. But he says there is an underlying fun attitude at the camp that he says all people have a proclivity for play, and it gets their imaginations going. And meanwhile, it helps boys and men to, primarily the boys, to experience that natural, you could even say, fierce energy, to some extent get it out of their system, in that controlled environment, and then say, okay, now let's talk about how we can channel that energy. In regards to the quest versus battle part, I believe that you could meet with similar levels of success. I think the mentality behind the battle structure in camp is the directors acknowledge boys are naturally aggressive. We know this, and so they don't believe in telling them to suppress that energy or to pretend like it's not there. Rather, they teach them to take a little bit of time to embrace it, experience it, and now here's how you need to work with it. Yeah. Interesting. Kendall.
A question that links a little bit, people have been asking about the format, but the other question, in case I missed it, the aspect of emotions, when I think of as a growing understanding, part of the disconnect with males and their contributing engagement to the world. There's a lot of pointing towards lack of awareness of personal emotions, lack of ability to map them, or to navigate positive and negative emotions and step forward. Just what you see is that seeming to you to be an important part of, is it more like programming and teaching, or this sense of emotional maturity and vulnerability and a space for it, either within the psychological development aspect or even with the programming of the camp? Is that something that you see as necessary or present in either of those areas?
Okay, so just to make sure I followed you around the room here, you're asking if within the camp, is the focus more on that programming and that teaching a certain way of behavior and being in the world, that versus teaching men to really understand their own emotions and their own experience?
Yeah, just how much room is there for the emotional aspect, right? And be like, and there's different degrees that people do that, but yeah, what room is there for that? And
Totally.
does the psychology speak to that as well?
Yeah, the psychology speaks to that, and the directors, they acknowledge that and kind of prepare for it in that the participants of the camp are not treated like machines, right? That you can just program. They acknowledge that that the environment of the camp is safe, challenging. The teenaged attendants are placed into roles of leadership, and in my own time assisting with the leadership program, I've had more than a few of the young men just break down. They're like, "This is too much," right? Trying to lead boys, and while we're prepared for that, we don't necessarily think that is a bad thing. They acknowledge that we need to be prepared for that to happen and come alongside a young man when he experiences various kinds of emotions or insecurities. The team is ready to walk alongside boys or even fully grown men as they encounter that. And so there's definitely an allowance for and an emphasis on both. Does that help?
In connection with the aggressive, the military aspect of your camp and stuff, I couldn't help but think that, is that the reason that you got a haircut? That of a Mohawk warrior?
You got me, Andy. I'm sorry.
I think that question is a sign that we're nearing the end. But last chance, if anyone still has one more. Yes.
Yeah, I appreciate your research, and I think it's something I've been thinking about a lot in the light of sort of the Moncton shooting that happened a couple of years ago, where a single man committed attacks that seem to be quite prevalent, but also in connection to the fact that young men in Canada and America and in sort of Western society of Europe have turned to kind of like ISIS as sort of a place to belong. And so do you have any insight based on your research on like what we can do sort of pastorally as a society to help support kind of these angry young men that are choosing paths that many of us might seem as negative, but from my perspective it seems like they're choosing them in order to belong to something, which I think you spoke to in your thesis, that there's this like want to belong to something. So they're attaching to this thing that we as a society might see as being negative, but how do we do that?
Walter, I think I will branch into those gang stats after all. So I was doing some research for my own information on gangs to see what is the extent of the problem that I'm addressing in the thesis. And gang statistics alone, in the US alone, according to the FBI and various other associations, say that in the US alone, there are over 30,000 gangs with membership totaling in excess of 1 million people. The stats are that roughly 89 to 91% of those members are male. So I read that and I thought that is 1 million young men who haven't managed to develop healthily, to make a pro-social, life-giving, enriching affiliation with other men. That's 1 million young men who aren't thinking, how can I give myself to my community, etc. So in order to speak to your question, how can we as a society be pastoral to those men? The conclusion that I had when I completed the thesis is that these are grassroots ideas, is that it's going to take time to fix. It took time for us to get here. It's going to take us time to get out. And it starts at a local level with men thinking, how can I look out for my fellow men? How can I think about ways to be a creative, involved, enriching husband and father? And in my opinion, that's where it begins, where men look out for one another and start, and because they safeguard one another's development, we start seeing more and more of that kind of man in the future, and less men who feel that they have no alternative but to turn to something antisocial, like a gang. So how can we be pastoral to them is a less easy answer to the question. I kind of told you, well, here's where society can start being pastoral to them. Oh, that's a hard question for a psych major. But yeah, honestly.
It's a hard question for a divinity major.
Yeah, for sure. It's it does start with just meeting them where they're at. I think it begins with saying, this is the reality of the situation, and we don't do ourselves any favors by pretending it's not there. And so I think like identifying where these things come from and saying, how can we work to stop this from increasing, and then increase the numbers of pro-social men in the future is a pretty good place to start. Yeah.
All right, I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you, and thank everyone for your engagement.